I'm seated on stage with three extraordinary colleagues: Gore from Inlet Housing Authority in Anchorage, Alaska, Rick Goodemann, who works in Southwest Minnesota in housing preservation, and Dean Matsubyashi, who works at Little Tokyo Service Center in Los Angeles. And just, Liz did this a little bit last night at the Wing, but just to give you guys a quick little grounding in what the community development investment theory is that each of these folks represents an organization that's doing extraordinary work in a place, but hasn't necessarily systemically thought about partnering with arts and culture. And so the question that they're investigating over 3 years is, what would it look like not to change our mission, but to think about how artists, to think about how culture bearers, to think about how arts organizations can help us achieve those missions more effectively, more efficiently, and for more of our community. So those are the journeys that these folks are on.
We are the guinea pigs.
Yes, exactly. The canaries in the coal mine, the guinea pigs.
The Truman
Pick your favorite animal analogy. And the thing that really grabbed me when Liz would sort of talk about their work and when I would get a chance to visit with these guys and their colleagues is that each of these communities and each of these projects is in some ways honoring and preserving a cultural identity of a place. And each of them understands that the future of their community isn't going to look like the past. And so there's this sort of central question of, how do we honor the cultural identities? How do we honor the histories, plural, of our place and welcome in a different future, right? Can we do both of those things, and can we do it with arts and culture? So when we were preparing for this, we thought that we would sort of do the opening of this in kind of 4 acts. We have sort of 4 questions that we're going to use to introduce you to these places. And before we begin, just to sort of do a quick survey of the room, how many people have been to Anchorage, Alaska, in the room? Awesome, that's fantastic. How many people have spent time in rural Southwest Minnesota? The cities don't count. Excellent. And how many folks have been to Los Angeles? Oh, good for LA. Check that out.
All right.
Awesome.
How many people have been to Little Tokyo in Los Angeles? Hey, all right.
All right.
That's
awesome.
Like noodles, huh?
All right. So I'm going to ask Carol to begin by introducing us to Anchorage and talk to us a little. For those of us who didn't raise our hands, help us understand this place that's your home. Help us understand this place you're working. And ground us, if you would, this is something that came up in at least my seminar discussion, about when the history that you're sharing begins, right? You're about to introduce me to Anchorage. Where does the story that you're telling begin? And you've got some images that we're going to put up, and you guys will bring up on stage. So Carol Gore, Cook Inlet Housing, Anchorage, Alaska.
I do. Thank you. So before I can get to the actual place, I think I have to set the stage.
Yeah, please.
So I have 4 slides, and I want to start by saying I describe myself as a forever Alaskan of Aleut descent. And for those of you who don't know what Aleut is, there are 8 indigenous groups in Alaska, and Aleut is one of those. So I am Alaska Native descent. The map that you're seeing is not the usual map that you see, with Alaska typically located off the coast of California. So that is not true. Even I noticed the ArtPlace map has us way down in the Pacific Ocean. You know,
we ran out of money for canvas.
I wish. And while you can't see Russia from Wasilla, at our closest points, we're 3 miles from Russia. So when you think about the state of Alaska, it's 2 times the size of the state of Texas. It's 1/5 the size of the contiguous lower 48 states. If you were to lay it on top of that lower 48 states, it would reach both the east and the west coast. So the name Alaska comes from an Aleut word, Alyeska, which means the Great One. And I think in terms of history, when you think about the Great One, we didn't become a state until 1958. So if you think about, our people knew that it was the Great One before they even knew the rest of the lower 48 even existed. The population of Alaska is less than 800,000 people in total, which makes us the least densely populated state of all states. Next slide, please. Little known fact, Alaska is all Indian country. So the map that you're looking at is really divided by those indigenous groups that I was referring to. We had an Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act in 1972, which established this geography. And with one very small exception, there are no reservations in Alaska. So our land base is very uniquely different from other tribes that you might be familiar with. There are 232 federally recognized tribes in the state. That's about 40% of the states in America. And of those 8 indigenous groups, they are Aleut, Athabascan, Tlingit, Yupik, Inupiaq. So none of those names are the name of a tribe nor the name of a place. I want you to just think about that as we tell our story. We do most of our work in the Cook Inlet region, which is in the south central and lower part in the middle of the map. That's about 50,000 square miles. Anchorage has a population of about 300,000 people. Of that, about 40,000 of that population are Alaska Native people. So as a city, we have the largest percentage of Alaska Native American people of any major city in America, which makes us unique. 12% of our population are our indigenous people. We also have over 106 languages spoken in our school, with the most diverse zip codes in the country. Next slide, please. Alaska is beautiful. This is Mount Susitna, or Sleeping Lady. You can see this mountain from downtown Anchorage across Cook Inlet. And if you look very closely, our state is not only full of beauty, but it's also full of story. And I think that's what Jamie wants me to emphasize. So in that story, if you look at this picture very closely, it's an Indian maiden sleeping, waiting for her fiance, her warrior, to come home from battle. So if you were to visit Alaska, you would hear many of these stories, and it's replicated really based in the land. That's where our people first started. Next slide, please. And this is what Anchorage looks like today. This building is located directly across the street from our office, about 5 minutes from downtown. It's located in Spenard, where we're conducting our ArtPlace work. It's also, Spenard used to be a town, and now it's a community. So as you look at these pictures, you can see that we're full of opportunity, but our diversity makes that opportunity challenging. I would say as we look at trying to respect our history, respecting our culture, trying at the same time to respect that as people, we want this place to reflect both the history and what it could be potentially in the future. As we look at this, we're looking at our scarce capacity, scarce resources, and our desire to invite people as investors into our place. So as you talk about, you raise your hand, you've been to Alaska. It's easy. People want to come to Alaska, go on a cruise, come visit. But our investors have to be very courageous. It's a high cost area. So for us, I wanted to bring our village values to the work that we do. That means everybody is essential and everybody matters. Can we bring that as an Indian housing entity to an urban setting to empower people, build community, and provide a diversity of housing opportunities?
And can I just ask a quick thing? If I wanted to come to Alaska and buy a home or rent an apartment, what am I looking at in terms of the current housing market in Anchorage?
Average price of a home in Anchorage is about $367,000. That would be a home that was built in the 70s, and you'd have to put in probably another $100,000 to make it current. If you were to build new, a very small 6,000 square foot lot is about $200,000, and then you would build vertical from there. So $500,000 in new construction would be a starter home.
Rick, talk to us a little bit about Southwest Minnesota. Orient us to sort of what is this place, who are the people who are there, what is the current culture of the place? And I think we've got Rick's slides up next.
Okay. So our place is farm country, and we operate in about 32 counties of southwestern Minnesota, south central Minnesota. It's our core area. We also own property on a much larger scale than that across all of southern Minnesota and western Minnesota, almost the Canadian border. So our place is changing. It started, we're part of the Great Plains state. And as a Great Plains state, we have gone through depopulation for the last 50 to 60 years. As people have exited, as farms have gotten larger, as our agricultural communities have shrank. And this has been a long-term process. And then we had what's known as the farm crisis, and that occurred in the late 1980s. And things radically changed. The state of Minnesota, and particularly our region, awoke to the fact that we were way too heavily dependent on agriculture, and we needed to diversify our economy. And we were able to marshal the resources of the state and federal government, local communities, to heavily invest in diversifying our economy. And we created a lot of jobs, a tremendous amount of jobs. And in that process, and also really diversified the job base. So we went from largely agriculture to food processing to light manufacturing to agricultural manufacturing to services. But the common thread with these jobs are they were low-paying wages. We are the lowest earning part of Minnesota in the state. And in this process, we began to utilize all of the available labor and also all of the available housing. Our employers began importing people from everywhere, all over the world. And in the process, that generated the formation of my organization in 1992, where communities had utilized the labor source and housing shortages were becoming very critical. Employers could not add any more workforce in southwestern Minnesota. We needed to create housing, we needed to preserve housing, and also create different mechanisms to add new production. And in that process, it really started an in-migration from all over, as I said, the world. So people began first coming in from people that had been there for decades, which were largely Hispanic, Latino workers who were coming in to work the fields, and they were migrant labor. They began settling as these jobs began to become more permanent. So we have people from Latino backgrounds that are permanent residents of southwestern Minnesota and have been for the last 50 years. We then started this process of importing others from everywhere. And in the process, our communities really began to change. They began to change demographically. They began to become much more diverse. And a lot of opportunities were occurring within our communities. But these are very discrete workforce centers. So the picture, the slide really shows, this is Worthington, Minnesota. And in Worthington, Minnesota, which is about 12,000 population, there's 56 languages spoken in the school district. And these are people from East and West Africa, from Southeast Asia, from Southwest Asia, from Central and South America. So Worthington has really become a melting pot. But when we thought about this opportunity with the ArtPlace CDI, and we talked about this for quite a while internally, what could we use this for? How could we work with communities that seem to be struggling with change? And how could we do it in a way that opened economic opportunity for the newcomers, created opportunity for people to settle, and made a more welcoming place for these cultures coming across the world? And we began working with bringing in artists, really starting to do planning with our communities, and looking at changing the dynamics within the communities themselves. Next slide, please. And one of the things that we really were struggling with is how do we give voice to people that are newcomers in our communities who are, in a lot of respects, isolated because of language, who are struggling to find a place, to find housing, and we've used the CDI as a way of really giving us a platform to start trying to figure out how we could give voice to that. And as a community development organization and doing planning for years, we've typically done the top-down thing. We've worked with the stakeholders, the power brokers, to make things happen. That's how we've created affordable housing opportunities. That's how we've done home ownership opportunities, all the various programs that we've had. So we really wanted to change the dynamic and come a bottom up and really start working with people in the community itself. Next slide, please. And this is really, I think, an aspiration and a fact. This is Walnut Grove, Minnesota. And Walnut Grove is known for Little House on the Prairie. Walnut Grove has a large proportion of Hmong people that have come into the community and have made that home. It's a center of the Southwest Hmong community. And if you look at that mural, the mural is really something that was treasured by the old residents of Walnut Grove. It shows Laura Ingalls Wilder, it shows the wagon coming across the field, it shows the Little House on the Prairie. 3 years ago, a Hmong family bought the general store, and that is the general store. And they announced to the community that they were going to modify the mural. And there was instant angst. But if you look at what they did, it's really a fusion of culture. It's really a melding of Hmong people in the field, working the field, with other people who came before, who loved the earth, and shows Laura Ingalls Wilder with a Hmong woman standing side by side. I think that is the aspiration that we want to see for southwestern Minnesota. That is the promise that we think is within this work, and hopefully for the future of southwestern Minnesota.
And Rick, let me just ask you the same question I asked Carol. If I wanted to buy a home in Walnut Grove or in Worthington, what am I looking at?
In Worthington, you're looking at, for a new house, about $200,000. For an existing house, about $120,000 to $130,000. Walnut Grove, you're talking $30,000 to $40,000 for a single-family house, an existing single-family house, and nobody is building new homes in Walnut Grove.
So we've heard a sort of ancient story of a continuously inhabited place. We've heard a story that really begins in the 1840s with Northern European migration. 50 years ago added Latinx community members, and is now adding East African, West African, Southeast Asian community members. Dean, where does Little Tokyo's story begin? When did Little Tokyo become Little Tokyo? And introduce us to the place for those of us who maybe have just had the noodles.
Sure. Well, I know it's late, so a lot of people are fading, including myself. So I want to try to make this maybe a little bit more interactive. So how many people here work in long-standing neighborhoods of color in high-cost areas that are currently under assault right now through gentrification or displacement? Okay. So can you keep your hands up? All right. Well, so let me preface then my story about Little Tokyo, where I'll start off usually saying Little Tokyo is one of the most special places, neighborhoods in the world, but it's also not unique at all in terms of the parallels that it has with many other long-standing neighborhoods of color in these high-cost areas, both in terms of its history, but also the current challenges that they're facing today. So Little Tokyo is 143 years old. It's the second oldest neighborhood in the city of Los Angeles. It also represents one of 3 remaining Japantowns left in the entire nation. At its peak before World War II, there were once over 85 Japantowns across the country, just to give you a little bit more narrative. And all 3 of them are actually in California, the Japantowns: San Francisco, San Jose, and Los Angeles. And LA is the largest Japantown. But like other ethnic neighborhoods of color, Little Tokyo kind of came out of a period of deep racism, right, and racist land use, in which at that time, many, immigrants did not have the right to become citizens, could not own property, but was also subject to a lot of violence, employment discrimination, and housing discrimination. So the community had to come together, right, to support one another and to protect each other in order to survive. But Little Tokyo, like other neighborhoods of color throughout the country, not only survived, but thrived, right, because of the strong networks, because of they're able to the entrepreneurial spirit, the grit, and that, I think, has really not just elevated Little Tokyo, but all neighborhoods that we've dealt with, in the Los Angeles area. And, even though Little Tokyo has always been a very diverse neighborhood, a gateway for new immigrants, we're adjacent to Skid Row. During World War II, we were Bronzeville, where it became primarily African-American neighborhood. And actually, most of the Japanese Americans in Southern California do not live in the area. Yet, the neighborhood remains the historic cultural center for the Southern California Japanese American community, which I think is about 125,000 people total. And the reason being that, it's home to 8 temples and churches, so it's a very spiritual place. And there are also a number of very long-standing arts and cultural institutions like the Japanese American Cultural and Community Center, the Japanese American National Museum, which are really critical because the arts and culture are not just a means to an end, right? But it's actually deeply woven into the fabric of our communities and plays a huge role in defining who we are as a community, but also binding us together as a community. So I think that's a big reason why Little Tokyo has been able to sustain itself over the years. This image you see is a historic photo of Nisei Week, which is an annual festival in which we celebrate the Japanese American community, and it's the second longest running ethnic festival in the entire nation. Could anyone guess what the #1 longest running ethnic festival is in the entire nation? Lithuanian Days in Pennsylvania. Go figure, someone told me, I was like, oh, all right, that sounds good. Another interesting tidbit about Little Tokyo is where the California roll was invented, so if you ever want to impress your friends. So if you can do the next slide, please. So Little Tokyo has also evolved to become the base for a broader Asian American and Pacific Islander arts and cultural scene. So besides the institutions like the JACC and JANM, Little Tokyo now is the home for East West Players, which is the oldest Asian American theater group in the nation, and Visual Communications, which operates the longest running ethnic film festival in the nation as well. So it's evolved into this arts and cultural space, not just for Japanese Americans, but for Asian Americans and other Pacific Islanders. And this image here right now is even showing how it's going beyond the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. So I'm not sure if you can tell, but you see this is an activation of a public alleyway in Little Tokyo that we did last year. And you can see people kind of dancing in the traditional Japanese garb, the kimono. And it's actually part of what a festival called Fandango Obon, which Fandango, the Spanish dance, and Obon, which is the traditional Japanese dancing. So it's really the melding of these cultures. So Great Leap, which is headed by Nobuko Miyamoto, works with Quetzal, a Chicano Latino organization in Borough Heights area, and together they kind of crafted this very unique dance, which is very representative of Los Angeles and very representative of what Little Tokyo represents today. It's also important to note this alleyway right here, is not just an activation of just a underutilized space, but it's also very historic. It's the historic Azusa Street, where Biddy Mason, who's one of the first African-American landowners in Los Angeles, owned a number of properties, and it was actually at this site where the first Pentecostal church got started by Reverend William Seymour. It's also the home for the very first AME church in Los Angeles, which is very historically significant as well. So just shows you the diversity which is inherent not just in Little Tokyo, but I think in a lot of ethnic enclaves throughout the country as well. So, despite this rich history and culture, another thing we share with other ethnic enclaves is a long history of encroachment and displacement. So for Little Tokyo, that began, right, with World War II and the incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese Americans along the West Coast to the 50s, 60s, and 70s during a period of urban renewal and redevelopment, which we saw the government agencies basically take entire blocks of land in Little Tokyo, displacing thousands of low-income residents, but also many family-owned small businesses. And today, I would say the biggest threat, right, to our neighborhoods is gentrification and displacement. We're directly adjacent to downtown LA, which has since become the preferred destination for the young professional demographic, which is really great because it's bringing a lot of investment, a lot of activity to the downtown LA area. But what's happening is that it's just triggered this development spree that's having kicked into hyperspeed, right? So private developers are just trying to swallow up as much land as they possibly can to develop luxury, right, market rate housing, which, as if you compare it to a low-income ethnic neighborhood like Little Tokyo, there is this kind of, it's not incongruent, right? So there's a mismatch happening here. And there's also this, so what you're seeing, the question around what are the current rents. So for a studio apartment now in Little Tokyo is about $2,600 a month. For commercial storefronts, where a lot of our ethnic small businesses used to use, it goes to about $650 a square foot, where in a lot of other neighborhoods, like in other parts of Little Tokyo, it's about $150, $185. So it's really transforming who is able to afford and continue to stay in Little Tokyo. It's also definitely creating these displacement pressures, right, where owners of other housing, whether it be affordable or not, are really thinking about cashing out, right, and then selling to the highest bidder. But the only thing that they could develop, given the high cost of that high acquisition cost, is market rate housing. So that's what we're facing right now. So that's the sense of urgency. The other sense of urgency, and if you can maybe go to the next slide, that we're facing is there's close to 20 acres of city-owned land in Little Tokyo that is prime for some sort of community-driven development, right? But the city is also planning to issue, would prefer to issue an RFP and sell it to the highest bidder. So of course, the private development community is very interested, and the vultures are definitely circling. So that is the urgency also for the community to also really kind of get our act together. But we're hopeful, and we're hopeful for, I would say, 3 reasons, right? One is that we have very strong community institutions with a long history of collaboration, because one group cannot do it on its own, and what we're finding out, even multiple groups, is very difficult, right, to kind of push back against some of these market rate pressures. 2, the community is very organized and is kind of used to already kind of having these fighting on behalf of the community, so it's kind of primed and ready to kind of take this on. And last but not least, about 3 years ago, the community came together and kind of created its own vision for what Little Tokyo should be looking like in the future. And it's called Sustainable Little Tokyo. And it really looks at a vision for the neighborhood that supports the local small business economy, leverages the rich cultural, kind of spiritual assets in the community, and promotes environmental sustainability and social equity. And then for us, for the ArtPlace grant, we really want to figure out how we can deploy or use more creative strategies to really elevate the community's efforts for control and self-determination by incorporating artists, other culture producers to help broaden our base, because we recognize that small critical mass in Little Tokyo is not enough, and that there are people who are coming in who do care about living in Little Tokyo. 2, to organize the stakeholders to revise and update this vision. And last but not least, to launch a serious public campaign which we call a moral site control campaign for these 20 acres that are left here in Little Tokyo, that we will hopefully push the city to try to transfer to the community before issuing out to a private developer.
That's fantastic. And I want to use that sort of notion of vision as sort of a jumping off point. I want us to sit in a moment of optimism and sort of project yourselves 20 years in the future. Everything's gone 100% correctly. I'm a newspaper reporter, and I'm coming to interview you, Carol, who's still at Cook Inlet Housing, about the Spenard neighborhood. What's my headline? What's my lead? What's the first paragraph look like? Describe the ideal Spenard 20 years in the future if you hit all home runs for the next 2 decades.
If I hit all home runs.
Yes.
I would say, first of all, the headline is Spenard welcomes everyone. That would be my headline. And I would say you have to kind of hear the from-to statement. Yeah. From a strip club, a gas station, a church, an office building that used to be a post office, our own office, to 150 units of mixed income housing with affordable set-asides, to places where artists work, live, and they're reflected in the external of our work, where the church is a cultural commons that celebrates all cultures, not just Alaska Native culture. I think that would be my nirvana. I would also say we're in a place, you saw the picture with the Quonset hut, it's a lot of pavement. And if we could green that up, Alaska Natives are all about the land, and if we could bring some respect to that. There is a creek that's hidden in a culvert under a road, and it's probably not going to happen in my lifetime, but at some point we want to respect the place that the creek used to be, and at some point, maybe after I'm gone, that creek gets daylighted, and the place has already been provided for that to happen because we believe it's going to. So the potential is there, and the dream lives on, and the vision lives on. So we've not only had this great nirvana, but we've also created a future place.
That's awesome. Rick, same question for you. Worthington, 20 years in the future, you get all your wishes, right? You get the genie on your shoulder, all your wishes come true. What's Worthington look like in 2037?
Well, within my lifetime, it's already changed significantly when I talked about the fact that we had depopulation, that our downtowns were falling apart, that our schools were underutilized. All of that is changing, and it's changing in a really positive way. So when we look to the future, we really want to see a more vibrant and, as Carol said, welcoming communities. And we are seeing a lot of that. We're seeing a diversification of services. We're seeing a diversification of our downtowns. We're seeing more people coming in. Our schools are filling up. And there's a sense of opportunity. There's a sense of we can really, we can grow, we can thrive. The communities that are smart about this, see the economic potential, support the new populations, and have a vision of a turnaround that means that southwestern Minnesota becomes a place that people want to come live, work, and play, and that we end up with thriving communities from a place that 30 years ago things were looking rather bleak. So that would be.
And if I landed that, if I had that house in Worthington and I moved there 20 years in the future, where am I taking my kids to do their back to school shopping? Where are they going out on dates on Saturday night? What's that look like?
And we're doing a lot of work with the community on really looking at what kind of amenities, what should, working with the artistic community on what should be the vision. Some of the work we're doing now is taking one of the uglier commercial streets in Worthington, which is the Oxford Street, and really working on what should that look like? What is the vision? What are the design elements? Working with Nobles County on their government center, which they tore down a beautiful old courthouse and built this kind of monolithic government center, and working with the county on redesigning the front of that fronts the downtown 10th Street, and creating a plaza where people can celebrate, where music festivals can be held, where people can come together to celebrate their heritage.
That's awesome. Dean, it's 2037. We're celebrating the 10th anniversary of the 20-acre parcel, and everything's happened exactly right.
Right.
What are we celebrating?
Well, so the headline would read, broad, diverse group of Little Tokyo stakeholders celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the ambitious Sustainable Little Tokyo project with a block party. And the banner that kind of streams across says, "Welcome to Little Tokyo, please take off your shoes." So I say that because, for us, the big challenge around newcomers and how we want to integrate them into the community. How many folks here, Asian, non-Asian, take your shoes off before you enter the house? Right? So in the Japanese culture, it's almost a sign of respect, right? That you take your shoes off before you enter one's house so you don't track mud, dirt into the community. So what we're trying to say with that message is that, yes, everyone is welcome to Little Tokyo as long as you respect the fact that this is a historic ethnic neighborhood with a pre-existing identity, a rich history and culture. If you can get down with that, then let's party, right? But unfortunately, that's not what's always happening. So how do you then discern and kind of filter that out? So that's been our kind of biggest struggle in terms of how we do that.
That's awesome. Another fabulous pivot. So now let's sit in a moment of pessimism, right? Let's talk let's do the glass is totally empty, right? What's going to prevent Spenard from being that welcoming, wonderful neighborhood that's infused with native values, that respects the land, that respects the people, that is no longer strip clubs and former post offices? What's going to prevent that fabulous future from happening? What's the biggest threat? What's the biggest risk?
Well, in a word, resources. And I think we're all sort of singing the same song. Declining state economies, no local economy. We're all trying to optimize ourselves out of what is a really big ditch. And what's happening at the federal level is certainly not encouraging to people of any color.
And Carol, just for those of us who don't know the Alaska economy perfectly, talk to me about some of the threats to what are specific to Alaska about what's happening with the state economy.
Well, of course, we're driven by oil revenues. That is not a pretty place to be. And so our state has gone from a robust black number at the bottom to a very large with a B, red number at the bottom. And our legislature has been in paralysis for 2 years, really talking about their differences in philosophy instead of trying to find solutions. We have no state income tax. We don't have a sales tax. We really have no tools with which to drive resources. I would also say this, it's very, very expensive to build in Alaska. I think it's a sad story that as an Indian housing entity, we're the only producer of affordable housing in Anchorage and have been for years. There are some other builders, but it's very, very difficult. It takes 8 to 12 pieces of money in a capital stack, and you draw out just one of them and the whole thing collapses. So, from a local family foundation to low-income housing tax credits to federal funding, which is our Indian housing block grant that we're using to serve everybody as that first in money, and whatever other scrap of money we can pull together in that stack. If it's $10,000, it's going to make a difference. Every development we've built has been at least $10 million. That is a challenge to put a capital stack together. Some of our developments have been $25 million, and we rarely build more than 45, 48 units. So you're getting a sense of what it costs in a per unit. Our infrastructure is all beyond its useful life. So as a housing developer, we're building roads, we're building water and sewer. In Spenard, where we're building, we found that the neighborhood, which is 5 minutes from downtown, if you remember, They were on wells and not even hooked up to either water or sewer in that area. So we're much more than a housing developer or a community developer. We're kind of everything. For me, it's like being in the village where you wear every hat. And you have to use every resource you have, whether it's a dollar resource or a capacity resource. We're far away from the lower 48, and frankly, people do love to visit, and they come and visit often, and we love their ideas and we love their enthusiasm, but very few of them leave a penny behind.
And just, I mean, you're a very polite, generous person. When people come to visit and offer their ideas to you, do you really love that?
Yes.
All the time?
I would say most of the time. You know, maybe I would say the reason I say that is because we also lack exposure. Distance is isolation, and it's isolation for ideas, it's isolation for innovation. And so exposure to even forums like this, I've learned a lot in a day and a half. Even as I've been stranded without a hotel room for hours, I've met people that had ideas, and I've had conversations that I'm going to take home. And we'll talk about them when we get home, and we'll share them. And from that, we'll have some things that we can actually put on the ground. Little things matter, big things matter, but we bundle all those together to make something happen. So I think that exposure is what I talk about, not just in Alaska, but also Indian country in general. I think we lack exposure to new ideas and new thinking, and even how do we replicate the history from where we've come from. I'd like to think I've done a little teaching myself, but I've done an awful lot of learning, and I hope that never stops.
Thank you for that. Rick, same question for you. You know, you have this vision of Worthington as a place where I don't have to go to the cities to do my shopping. I can go to a music festival on the weekend. I can eat some wonderful food. What's going to prevent that? What's going to not let that happen?
So we're a region of small communities, and part of what Carol talked about, lack of resources, is certainly a challenge. The other thing that's occurring right now is we have a lot of jobs, and we cannot at this point create housing that's affordable to the workforce. So we're seeing economic development, we're seeing job growth stall, we're seeing people that would want to invest in our communities and add more jobs be unable to because there's nowhere to house the new employees. And a lot of this has to do with value, prevailing rents, low-income jobs, and it's come to the point that we're very, very heavily dependent on subsidies. So we're dependent on the low-income housing tax credits. We're dependent on the resources from the state that's appropriated in the legislature. And as Carol said, those funds are certainly drying up as well. The other issue that is occurring is there's almost a feeling of the workforce centers, the more diverse parts of our region are almost besieged, and that has occurred really over the last 12 months, during the campaign. And many of the newcomers who have come into our communities, who've lived here 5-10 years, there's fear. There's a feeling that they're not welcome. And that is not so much from a community like Worthington or a community like St. James or Milan. It's really the surrounding community. It's the farm community. It's the smaller ag communities who somehow feel threatened by what's occurring. And a lot of this makes no sense, no logical sense at all. The farmers are reliant on labor to process the chickens, the pigs, the beef that they raise. They are very much dependent on a market in Mexico, and yet they talk about building walls and are really bought into that language. The same with Chinese trade. So that's really, really troubling because on one aspect, many of us recognize that the future of our region is heavily dependent on people coming in and wanting to live, settle, invest, raise their children, and do what everybody else wants. They want a good place to call home. And to have this kind of thing going on is indeed very, very troubling. And it's things that I've worked with or worked on for the last 30 years of my life. My staff has worked on through our life. It's really how do we transform and change what was really a very a region of the state that was in a deep recession, has come out of it, and now is threatened again by national politics in reality.
So Dean, join us. The 20-acre site doesn't become a shared community amenity. It becomes the headquarters for a driverless car company, right? Why did that happen? What went wrong?
Well, I think for a lot of neighborhoods that are struggling with gentrification and displacement, lack of resources, yes, is a threat or a challenge. But I would say the biggest threat, though, is lack of power, right? Like one of my mentors, Gordon Chin, founding executive director for the Chinatown CDC in San Francisco, always said, it's more important to control development than to do development, right? And we're an affordable housing developer, so we do development, right? And what we're realizing is you cannot deal make your way through this crisis that we are facing right now. And how decisions get made around land use, right? What gets developed for whom, right? Oftentimes becomes a very political decision, right? So, and unfortunately, the way a lot of decisions get made is the role of money and power. So for a lot of communities like Little Tokyo, where we don't have that, we have to come up with alternative strategies for how do we accumulate power to be able to push back and to really reclaim control over land that was once taken away from us when at that point we didn't have power either. So that's why, I'm really excited. Oh, thank you. I don't know if Maria Rosario Jackson's here, but I listen to her every time she speaks. And for me, that's why we are very intrigued with, this whole ArtPlace creative strategy component, because, what I'm learning is, the arts and culture it connects people, right? It generates empathy, and what we hope will also inspire action, right? I think that's what we need to see more in our neighborhoods, and that's why we're really excited to be part of this panel and be part of the ArtPlace family.
Well, so once again, you sort of perfectly pivoted. So let me sort of go in the opposite direction, ask you to keep going on that. So, the sort of last question is, what is it you need artists to do? What are you counting on culture bearers to do? How can places like the Japanese Museum, the Cultural Center, help you create that community power, create that self-determination? What is it that arts can do that hasn't been happening so far in the work that you guys have been doing?
Yeah, once again, for us, we see the arts and culture as, once again, not just a means to an end, but also kind of integral to kind of the community and its identity. So they are part of the process in terms of, one, crafting the vision. So they are part of the planning committee, along with other stakeholders, to define what is it that our community needs. They also, are able to hopefully help us think outside the box in terms of how are we broadening, right, our base to build up that sort of power to be able to push back. How can we more effectively organize, our stakeholders to have a larger voice, and more importantly, how can we deploy, more creative ways to try to affect positive change, right? Beyond our simple organizing, where it's just yelling at the man and kind of organizing, mobilizing people. I think there are more creative strategies to draw attention to the crises, to put I think our elected officials more on the spot. So how can arts and culture kind of help us elevate our game a little bit in that regards?
Awesome. Rick, you had talked about sort of politics, fear, polarization as threats. What is arts and culture going to do to get us to our utopian vision and not allow those things to overtake us?
So when we think about this, to help us more effectively communicate and communicate in a different way, also to really help us to define and embrace change and say, you know, this is a good thing, and really define, you know, the story of change so that we can present it in a more positive way and hopefully change the dynamics that are out there. And really, I think to look at the type of work we're doing and to you know, make it more meaningful and take us in different directions. And we're already seeing that happen with a lot of the projects that we're undertaking. It's really been mind-blowing in some ways, eye-opening, a much different approach than you know, the typical, this is a community development project, this is what we're going to do, and being open to change and different ways of approaching a project.
Thank you. Carol, you talked very specifically about money threats, right? That there is a very precarious stack of money, and if that 15% of it that is HUD funding changes by 25%, we potentially topple. In that context, what are you counting on artists to do to get us to that bustling Spinard, welcoming everyone, generating excitement?
I think there's a couple of things. It's amazing, you always think you know your own story better than anyone, but introducing their perspective to our perspective has really made our story more relevant. I think we've tended to approach housing because it's such an urgent need in our community as one lot at a time, one building at a time, one parcel at a time, one project. And they have broadened that for us to think as if it's a canvas. And I think as we sort of think about working on a larger canvas at a community level where we're looking at the whole instead of the parts, the engagement we get from the artist, I think, will help us think more thoughtfully about what resources we need. I'm really anticipating they will expand our own horizons about what we want those developments to be on that bigger canvas. The resources will expand along with that because they will need to be differently. Maybe that 15% of our first in money becomes 10% because we're doing different things and we're doing that in a different way. I will tell you, they have created anxiety and they've also created new thinking about potential. We originally bought the church to tear it down and build our own office building, and it was a company-wide decision to halt that idea. And I'm really, really proud that that happened, and it wouldn't have happened without different engagement from artists. So thinking about community is beyond our own internal needs and about the neighborhood needs is, I think, very rich. And I think that's going to change how we look at resources and that potential. They bring capacity we don't have.
One of the things when we were sort of talking about the conversation we wanted to have, I wrote down, at one point you said, we lost our culture to rule books and building codes. We were building projects, not homes. We lost our storytelling, which is something that's very important, especially in Dena'ina culture.
Yes.
Will you just say a word about story?
Yeah. So we're a people that really doesn't have much written language, and so the only way that we can share who we are is through our stories. That's not just in the oral history, but it's also in the dance and in the art, in the jewelry that we wear. It's a replication of our subsistence lifestyles and our use of materials. The clothes that we wear, this is a kusbuk. It's a traditional a garment that we all wear for practical purposes, but it's become a garment that we use to celebrate our culture as well. So I think that our native culture is going to be something that's more proudly replicated in what we do as a result. I'm just excited to be where we are with ArtPlace.
Fantastic. So we're drawing to a close. We're going to send people off, joining them to a fabulous time tonight. But sort of being in this room with this group of people, with you guys on stage, what's one thing you want folks to walk away with? What's one question you want folks to carry out? What's one teaching you would like them to know? What's one something that you want to make sure that people have in their hearts and minds as we're going out? Dean, let me start with you and we'll come down.
I'm drawing a blank. You know, places matter, and we need to do whatever we can in terms of building up the power of these places to make sure that they're able to remain the special places that they are.
Awesome. Rick, one thought.
That change can be good if it's done in the right way, and I think we need to, from our perspective, embrace this change, welcome this change, and in the end, we're going to have a more robust society.
Awesome. Thank you. Carol, one thing you'd like people to carry out?
I think I would just maybe issue a challenge. If an Indian housing entity can change its work to serve everyone, to serve all people, I think it's the right approach to community development. I will tell you it's a source of conflict with my own people. Are you Indian enough? But I'm telling you it's worth it, because we're serving more of our own people in a diversity of places than we ever could if we spent $1 Indian dollar at a time on strictly Indian people. And I'm most proud that we've embraced the idea of serving everyone. So I would encourage you to think about your perspective of your own work and where is your outside of the box thinking about who you're serving.
I'm not going to add a thing to that. Please join me in thanking everyone.